So why did they write down the Gospel so late? Um, if you were doing some studies of first century Judaism, you would know that it was pretty usual that rabbis were giving their messages to the disciples and they learned them by heart. And they repeated them and they um, gave them to next generation as an oral tradition. So oral tradition is a really common thing in first century Palestine. So I would say it makes perfectly sense to say that the disciples and the early church, which was mostly based on Jewish Christians, um, had like a first oral gospel which they learned by heart and which they repeated, for example, in their church services. And the fact that a lot of Greeks and heathen people converted to Christianity made it necessary for them to write it down. Another example is Luke, who writes it down because he wants to do an account for his friend Theophilus. Um, so there was no reason to write it down before 60, 70, maybe 50. There's a lot of discussion about dating Mark in the 50s. So why not? So I think the only reason they didn't write it down before was because there was no reason to write it down, because Judaism in the first century was an oral tradition. So what about nobody else reporting about Jesus? Actually, it's not true that nobody else caught talking about Jesus. Josephus, for example, talks about Jesus, or Plinius talks about Jesus. Plinius, the Roman historian, Josephus, a Jewish historian who kind of was a traitor to his Jewish companions and stick to the Roman Empire. But what to say? What kind of information do we have of First Palestine Judaism? What kind of historians were writing about first century Palestine? We don't have a lot. There is just like Plinius or Josephus, and they were both writing about Jesus. And on the other hand, there were a lot of people claiming to be the Messiah in that time. It was nothing unusual. It was nothing unusual that Jesus came and said, I am the Messiah. There were a lot of people claiming to be a prophet or the Messiah. The unusual thing about Jesus is that he died and also rose again, which confirmed his messiahship to Israel. But the mere fact that a lot of messiahs came up in that time because of the need of the people to hear some message from God because they were occupied by the Romans was not unusual. So there was not a lot of interest by Roman historians, other historians, to write about special persons in Palestine. The Jewish religion at all was not a lot of interest to the Greek and Roman people. They actually really were discussed by Jews. The Roman society was really discussed by Jews. Also, the Greek society, or the Greek people, they didn't like the Jews for having a day off. This is the Sabbath, or for not eating pig. So this is why they're not interested in Jesus as a Jew or the Jewish society in Palestine in the first century. And this is why we don't have any other account. Giving all of this, my explanation for dating, let me give you one other example. I talked about 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. There's a lot of scholarly consensus about these two verses being really old, like from the 30s or the 40s, and also being located in Jerusalem. So people say this is kind of a creed or a hymn, these two verses are kind of a creed or a hymn which were sung in the early church in Jerusalem in the 30s or 40s, and which Paul just cites or quotes in his letter to the Corinthians. Given that this is a really small time compared, I mean, compare the recordings of the New Testament and also the text transmission of the New Testament to any other ancient document, you'll find that no other ancient document is that good transmitted or is that close to the events it describes than as the New Testament. There is, like when did Josephus write about Ezra? This is like 500 years later. We have the same thing with Homer, who's writing about ancient Greek history. They're like the New Testament is the best known document from the ancient history we have. There's nothing you can compare to that. So claiming that the New Testament is really, let's say, fallible and is more like a myth than a historical account seems to me to be not a really sophisticated view, and a view which does not accept academical research. So you claim for yourself that you base your thinking on academical research. I would like to challenge you to think about that. I think you read a lot of books written by people who don't like Christianity at all and who are really fascinated by the idea that there are some other gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, and that Christianity is a really political and bad religion who hates women, and therefore they take out the bad books. If you look at it in history, I don't think there's any evidence for this claim. The process of canonization is much more complicated than just the Council of Nicaea. So I want to challenge you. Maybe you think I'm a dumb Christian with no common sense. If you think that, I'm sorry for you, because I think what I just talked about maybe proves that I kind of have some common sense, and I want to challenge you to keep on the discussion. Goodbye.